talking about the dominion of God. We Reformed people will often talk about the sovereignty of God. Another word that is often used in connection with this is the majesty of God. You're talking about things like authority and power, which we talked about in a previous week. There are certain words that are used in the Bible, and it's not always talking about the broadest sense of these words. So we'll get a chance to parse out some of that. As always, Charnock has an opening verse, and in this case it's Psalm 103, verse 19. The Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all. He's going to bring this verse back a couple times in the course of this chapter. And like any other, it's a verse that has a context. The context here is a larger train in that psalm where the psalmist is recounting benefits, and he's getting his soul to recall those benefits that God has given. And Charnock talks about, I'm not going to give the whole exposition of the verse because it lasts, half a dozen pages or so, but if you just look at the words established or prepared in some translations, Charnock uses this to show that this is outwardly directed dominion. This is not talking about something in God, although it is something that God has in himself. We'll talk about that in a second. But obviously, in order to rule over things, even the title Lord, theologians will talk about this sometimes, how words like Creator and Lord and Redeemer, those are words that belong to God in a relational sense. And of course, God was free not to create. And having created and the fall having happened, he was free to not redeem. So that belongs to a class of words that are used about God. But that can be misleading because Charnock's going to say that though he establishes this thing or prepares this thing or rules over this thing, still there's a sense in which this is incommunicable. There's something in God. Now, the purpose of the word heavens, he really draws that out about how that notes the glory of this dominion. He gives verses for each of these. The supremacy of this empire, that it's over all the ones that you're thinking of in this world. That it's peculiar, that it's vast. He talks about all the different things that this word heavens, that its duration is forever, because it speaks about the eternality. It's not just a place, it's something that's above and beyond creation itself. So he says the heavens are incorruptible. Earthly empires have their decays and dissolutions. So anyway, he just goes into all the words that are used in that verse and shows what that teaches us. Here's the doctrine. And it's very simple, very uncontroversial, until you start examining some other views that are out there and you realize, well, actually, there's a lot of people that don't really believe this, but call themselves Christians. They agree on paper. God is sovereign, Lord, and King, and exercises a dominion over the whole world, both heaven and earth. I think most evangelicals would look at that and say, yeah, we agree with that. Okay, well, how much control? Control, wait, you didn't say that word. Well, that's implied in this. So I think a lot of people are fine with God being sort of what we call a titular head, sort of someone like the Queen of England, reigns but doesn't rule, that sort of thing. I think people are fine with that, as long as it doesn't get too sovereign, right? And there's even theologians, I'm amused by this, I say you're not a theologian at all if you talk like this, that'll use this language of strong sovereignty and weak sovereignty. Have you ever heard that? Weak sovereignty. Well, that's like a square circle. That's no sovereignty at all. Okay, this is either absolute or we're not talking about the same thing. Now, before he gets going, he gives us a little grammar because there are different senses of God's dominion over things. And you can apply this even to Christ, and Reformed theologians do apply this to Christ to talk about what's called his essential reign versus his mediatorial reign. One of them just has respect to his divine nature as the Son of God, who's eternal. And in that sense, the Son of God reigns over everything, and he always has. But then you see in the Scriptures, there's these verses that talk about him being given a kingdom, or him even giving that kingdom up to the Father, or, things like that. What's that about? Well, that's about his human nature as the Christ. So what Charnock is going to talk about here is something that applies to Christ, but this is an actual this is a more general designation. There's a threefold dominion of God, he says. Now, this is just word for word Charnock. Number one, natural, which is absolute over all creatures and is founded in the nature of God as creator. So that's just the nature of things as they are. If you have a creator and creation, it's not like he gets to rule because he got there first. It's just the nature. It couldn't be any other way. It would be absurd to think about created reality detached or not owing itself to God. So that's just the nature of things. It's unavoidable. Secondly, though, spiritual or gracious dominion. Gracious, he just means by grace. So what does he mean? It's a dominion over his church as redeemed and founded in the covenant of grace. So it's not now, there's a certain point where he no longer rules over the unbeliever. No, he does in this way, but now in a special way, he rules over the church. Third, a glorious kingdom at the winding up of all, wherein he shall reign over all, either in the glory of his mercy, as over the glorified saints, or in the glory of his justice in the condemned devils and men. So think of that as the eschatological kingdom. That's another way you could say that, because there's a sense in which, well, why isn't there just these two? Well, it's because in the end, there's going to be this uncontested reign, which doesn't mean universalism, but it does mean that even the wicked who are in hell will no longer get to contest his reign. There's that verse in Philippians 2:10 and 11, where Christ does hand the kingdom over to the Father, and where it makes the point to say that every knee shall bow in heaven or on earth or under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Now, that is a begrudging. In the case of the reprobate and the devils, that doesn't mean that they've repented or anything like that, but they will begrudgingly have to be forced to confess the King. And then he ends up by saying, the first dominion is founded in nature, the second in grace, the third in regard of the blessed in grace. Okay, so that I kind of just already summarized that. So here's the outline. And I have to squeeze a lot into one day. Throughout. Let's first look at these general propositions, and he gives us 4 to open off with. These are just parameters. These are, before he really gets going, he's got to establish this. First, we must know the difference between the might and power of God, that's on the one hand, and his authority. You might mention, we already, remember we mentioned this when we talked about, it was when the chapter on the power of God. In the New Testament, there's different words that are used for power that are energy words or cause words, but then you have this word exousia, and the English will translate that sometimes power instead of authority, but it's basically talking about authority. So when you see power in those cases, or for example, when you say in Colossians 1:16 and Ephesians 6:12, I think when you see the language of principalities, thrones, dominions, powers will sometimes be the translation. So in all those cases, what's going on here is his authority. So Charnock is saying, let's make a distinction here between God's power, his might, his causal power, his affecting things, versus his right, his position, his rightful authority. So that's really all he's doing here. And here's how he says it. We commonly mean by the power of God the strength of God, whereby he's able to effect all his purposes. By the authority of God, we mean the right he has to act what he pleases. Second thing we've got to get squared away, he says all the other attributes of God refer to the perfection of dominion. Without this dominion, some perfections, as justice and mercy, would lie in obscurity, and much of his wisdom would be shrouded from our sight and knowledge. So what he's saying here is that we're treating the dominion of God as a theater, let's use Calvin's language, as the theater of God's glory, a way in which God ensures that the creature sees and beholds this or that part of his glory that you wouldn't see if he wasn't ordering things in this way. Classic text is just Romans 9. There's at least 3 attributes there. If I think about it, maybe more. Why election and reprobation? Why predestination? He gives you some. He lifted up Pharaoh for this reason, that his power might be made known. So something about God's power is on display by raising up Pharaoh. And then his mercy and his justice in election versus reprobation. And there's more as you go on in Romans 9 through 11, his wisdom and so forth. But that's what he's saying there in this second distinction right here. Third, this of dominion as well as that of power has been acknowledged by all. God has interwoven the notion of his sovereignty in the nature and constitution of man. It is stamped upon the conscience of man and flashes in his face in every act of self-judgment conscience passes upon man. Every reflection of conscience implies an obligation of man to some law written in his heart, and he cites Romans 2:15. When he says this, he doesn't mean everybody consistently, openly, exactly in the same terms that we would in the Bible, admits that God is sovereign. And so that's not what he's saying. He's saying that begrudgingly or unconsciously, or if you want to use the word, subconsciously, or in effect. There's all different ways you could say what Charnock's saying. They can't get away from this idea of sovereignty, and his main example of that is in their conscience. When they owe this obligation to whatever, even if it's an atheist, there are many things they say and do that bear witness to this. That's all he's saying there. He doesn't mean that they're, giving a thumbs up to the doctrine of divine sovereignty. Fourth, it's very closely associated with that. He makes this a matter, again, as he does with a lot of the other attributes of natural theology. He says this notion of sovereignty is inseparable from the notion of a God. You see, he uses that language again, which he does when he's talking about that. In other words, when you're talking about God at all, if you're not talking about a God who is sovereign, you're not talking about God. It's illogical. The nature of the thing no longer is the same thing. Now, again, it doesn't mean that even Christians, and I'll even go as far to say genuine Christians, won't get this wrong, as we all get all sorts of things about God wrong. And we will, just without thinking, we'll affirm the doctrine. We'll say, I'll go back to it, we'll say, yeah, I believe that, wherever it went, there. I believe that. And yet, they'll restrain God in this area or that area from their free will, usually, or something else, or from some sector of society or government. And they'll say, well, not that. He's not concerned with that. He doesn't, that's not a God thing. That's neutral territory. So you'll see genuine Christians talk like that, and I assume if they're genuine Christians, they'll grow out of that. Okay? But what Charnock is saying there is that it doesn't go together. That's a square circle. If you're talking about God at all, you're talking about one who is sovereign. I said there's all sorts of views that hold to a view that mangles that, like open theism. We've picked on open theists when we talked about God's knowledge, so I won't do it again here. Second point, the foundation of God's dominion. So I have a picture, and it's just representing the 5 things that he founds God's dominion, or Charnock says that God's dominion is founded on. So I'll just list these to you and explain a little bit what he means. First, on the excellency of his nature. So I said God in himself. So remember at the beginning I said this is external to him. God did not have to create a world, and therefore to talk about God being Lord or having dominion over stuff, well, that's not, it requires there to be stuff first, right? So that's what Charnock is saying. This psalm that he started with is talking about something that he has to establish or put in order or prepare. That's outside of himself. Now it seems like he's saying the opposite. But he's not contradicting himself. He's saying, yes, but before that, the very nature of his right over all those things is something in himself. So Psalm 86, 8 and 9, There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name." And he quotes also Jeremiah 10:7. "Who would not fear you, O King of the nations? For this is your due. For among all the wise ones of the nations and in all their kingdoms there is none like you." So he's basically using these verses to say there's something about God in himself that makes this natural. Second, his act of creation. That's all that second line there is meant to, that's the foundation to his dominion. So in other words, so you see what I mean by foundation now? What he means? He has this dominion. He's in control over everything. He's right to be in control. Everything that he does is right. Why? That's what I mean by foundation. Because he's the creator. He says, he who gives being, life, motion, who is the sole cause of the being of a thing that was before nothing, who had nothing to concur with him, nothing to assist him, but by his sole power commands it to stand up into being, is the unquestionable Lord and proprietor of that thing that has no dependence but upon him. Slightly awkward way to say that, but he's basically saying, if you got made by the Creator, what else would you expect? Your only reason for being is whatever reason he put into you. He has sole ownership of you. It would be absurd. It wouldn't just be wrong. It would be absurd to think of yourself as belonging to yourself or belonging to any other lesser being. So Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein." So everybody and everything is God's property. And every arrangement between everyone is God's property. So there's nothing about any of those that you can say afterwards, "Yeah, but that was man's idea, but we got that. We're handling that." No, that too is God's property. Third foundation of this, in the lordship implied by being the final cause of all. So 3 I have as the end cause. So what's he saying by that? The lordship implied by being the final cause of all. Well, the final cause, remember, or end cause, is the reason that the actor acts. God is the efficient cause of all things, but we've already seen that he's also the end cause of all things. He's his own reason why he does whatever he does. Anything else would be logically impossible. If nothing else exists, what reason can God have for doing anything outside of himself? It must be something in himself. So that's what we mean when we say he does such and such for his glory, or everything is for his glory. There's no other possible alternative. It's not just a pious thing we say, or because we're Reformed, that's the right answer. Anything else would be illogical and impossible. It's not possible for God to have another end cause but God himself. Revelation 4:11, "For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." Proverbs 16:4, "The Lord has made everything for its purpose." Perhaps most pointedly, Colossians 1:16, "All things were created through him and for him." So he created everything for himself. So if the maker of a thing has rightful ownership, as we've seen in the first 2 points, well, then so does his purpose in the making. His purpose has full ownership of a thing. Fourth, his preservation of things. So Charnock is using his preservation, so I just have a dotted line there. I don't know what else to... He's upholding everything. And we've talked about ways that that's the case. We've talked about providence. That, Charnock is saying, is a ground of his dominion. And he quotes a psalm, Psalm 95, 3 and 4, and he takes the 2 parts of this and he shows how one is grounded in the other. It says, "For the Lord is a great God and a great king above all gods." So that's talking about dominion. But Charnock asks why. He says, well, look at the next verse. "In his hand are the depths of the earth, the heights of the mountains are also his." In other words, because he owns it. Because it's his, because he's there and he upholds it and takes care of it. And fifth, finally, I have that represented by that timeline of all of history, innumerable benefits to the creatures. So because he's good to you. He says in Isaiah 1:2, "Children have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me." The whole idea of that statement is that it's shocking, their ingratitude. He's been good to them. He's cared for them. They belong to him, and yet they've rebelled against him. And that principle is intensified when you're talking about the ransomed people of God. So he brings in 1 Corinthians 6:19, "You are not your own, for you are bought with a price." And so he concludes, "Therefore your body and your spirits are God's." The nature of this dominion. He brings basically examines this in light of 5 things. 5 things you need to know about the nature of this dominion. It's independent, it's absolute, yet, so there's a counterbalance here, not because it needs to be balanced out, but because we naturally have suspicions. Oh, so he just has all power, then he could be a tyrant. He says, yet not tyrannical, but wise, righteous, and good. It's universal, and it's eternal. And there's a lot of verses here, so just very briefly, the independence of this dominion. That just follows from an attribute we've looked at, the aseity of God. You could say the self-sufficiency of God. So everything that he has in himself and everything that he does is not dependent on anything else. It's not caused by anything else. It doesn't have ultimate reference to anything else. So Charnock says, since he is independent in regard of his essence, he is also so in his dominion, which flows from the excellency and fullness of his essence. As he receives his essence from none, so he derives his dominion from none. Oh, that's like when we say, I've made Christ Lord of my life. No, you did not. You cannot make the Lord Lord. He has full ownership of you. You were awakened to your being owned by God, and you've appropriated that by the Holy Spirit into your heart, and you're starting to make corrections and things like that, but you didn't make him that. That'd be like, a slave in the ancient world, except infinitely more so, saying, I have made my owner the owner of me as a slave. That would be, the absurdity would be actually infinitely greater. But the idea is that he transcends all kinds of rules and all kinds of authorities that we're thinking of. He's not up for election, right? A lot of people need to work on that. You think about the eternal state, and I think there's probably a lot of Christians, if we're honest, especially in the modern West, that would struggle, if they're honest, with the idea of an absolute, full monarchy of Christ. And you say, well, it's the pious answer. I know I'll have to get straightened out there. But there's something about that that's, I think, distasteful to a lot of modern people. So he says this, he is therefore called King of Kings and Lord of Lords in 1 Timothy 6:15, needing no license from any when to act, nor direction how to act, or assistance in his action. When he uses creatures, it is not out of want of their help, but for the manifestation of his wisdom and power. You could also say his kindness and his grace, getting you involved in a sense. What he does by his subjects, he can do by himself. The government is upon his shoulder, Isaiah 9:6. Second, as far as his absoluteness of this dominion, Charnock means a couple of things by this. It's absolute with respect to its liberty, with respect to law, with respect to what he calls grievance, which some of these I think I'll skip over just because I say it's not a giant chapter of 150 pages, but it's still kind of a big chapter. It's at least 80 pages. And then he talks about invincibility. That would be another sense in which it's absolute. Some of those have to do with absolute authority. So I mentioned liberty. He's at liberty to do such and such. Grievance, in other words, bringing complaint against him. God does not have, I was just talking to somebody about an open door policy. Not the same kind you practice down here. He does not need advisors. That's not what prayer is for. But then the last one, invincibility, is about his absolute power. So Charnock brings in a couple of verses that talk about this. 2 Corinthians 4:6, God who said, let light shine out of darkness. And of course, that draws back on Genesis 1:3. That's the moment when God said, let there be light. And what Charnock is saying is that in the same way, and just as easily, God creates all the things that he does. God ordains all the things that he does. Psalm 33:9, he commanded and it stood firm. The psalmist there is talking about how he created everything. He speaks it into existence. Job 38:35, can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? And then Isaiah 43:13, also henceforth I am he, there is none who can deliver from my hand. I work, and who can turn it back? So hopefully you can see that when we're talking about dominion, you're looking at an intersection of attributes we've already looked at, and one of them being God's power, his omnipotence. And so it's very natural when you're talking about the sovereignty of God to also be talking about omnipotence, that he's invincible, that no purpose of his can be thwarted. You think of Daniel 4:35 as another verse that teaches that. I said I was going to skip over those other respects, his authority. We've kind of talked about it before, and some of these verses are repeated later. Why is it not tyrannical? Thirdly, is that just like, again, the pious answer? But he's God, and he wouldn't do that. Okay, why wouldn't he do that? And what does tyranny mean anyway? For a lot of people, God being sovereign at all is tyrannical because he's writing the script, because he's forcing such and such, he's guaranteeing such and such. Well, the things that you need most, you need guaranteed, and you can't do any of them. So that's actually very important and good. But the reason is because God in himself is all-wise, perfectly righteous, perfectly good. So this is, again, another strike against, it's a view we've talked about before, voluntarism, theological voluntarism, that God does everything by his sheer will. And it's the reason I brought up this view a couple times is because it's one that Reformed people might be tempted toward. Might be thinking, well, that just means that you can't go behind his will. That's true, as an explanation. Or no one can resist his will. That's true. Or his will is ultimate, above everything. That's true. But what a lot of people mean by that is something that is what we might call whimsical, or we would use the word arbitrary. And that word's undergone some change over the centuries as well. Everything you said right there is true, but does he do it against his nature? Does God ever act by will against his nature or without respect to his nature? So that's the idea of voluntarism. And what Charnock is saying is that no, and he's said this in all the previous chapters too. Here's how he says it here. As no intelligent creature, neither angel nor man, can be framed without a law in his nature, so we cannot imagine God without a law in his own nature, unless we would fancy him a rude, tyrannical, foolish being who has nothing of holiness, goodness, righteousness, wisdom. If he made the heavens in wisdom, Psalm 136:5, he made them by some rule, not by a mere will, but a rule within himself, not without. That last sentence is Charnock guiding us through two ditches. The one ditch I just mentioned is voluntarism. So he says, not by a mere will, in other words, a will apart from the rest of his nature. But then he says, by a rule not without, because one of the fears that drives people to voluntarism is to say, Charnock, look how you started this sentence. As no intelligent creature, neither angel, man, or whatever, can be framed without a law in his nature. Yeah, but you don't frame God. You don't say, and this is the problem they got into in the Enlightenment. You started to say that God is good and all-powerful and all these different things, but he can't do things that are contrary to reason or contrary to nature. And we started, I didn't do it, I wasn't there. People started to change the meanings of these words. And so I think there's this modern orthodox reaction to modern Enlightenment thinking, and we start to say, well, I don't want to put God in a box. I can see how man has to be put in a box because God put him there, so man has a certain nature. But if I start talking about God having a certain nature and God has to act, yes, he can do whatever he wants, but he has to act according to this rule. Well, wait a minute, hold on. Those rules are rules inside of himself, not some rule outside of himself. And that's why, one of the reasons why we study the doctrine of God, because we're studying all these attributes that are in God. So we can, whenever we see him acting by his will and no one restraining him and no one putting him in a box, he himself is that rule of goodness and righteousness and so forth. So Charnock is putting, this is actually a very profound statement, more than it may seem at first glance. So he devotes a page to each of those modifying attributes, which again, don't modify God from the outside. They don't fence him in from the outside. These are attributes of God himself. God always acts according to what Charnock calls the rule of wisdom, the rule of righteousness, and the rule of goodness. And so he says, he quotes Psalm 89:14. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. It's a biblical poetic expression in the poetic portions of the Bible to say that God has a throne. He has a rule. No one can stop him. He does as he pleases, as another psalm says. When he does that, righteousness and justice and love and faithfulness are what are shooting forward or what are on the move. Okay, and the throne where he sits, Charnock says, is called his holy throne, Psalm 47:8. But also, Charnock says, the throne of grace, Hebrews 4:16. So it's a matter of balancing out, remembering more and more the attributes we've learned about and saying, okay, I'm not fencing God in here. I'm fencing my own brain in here by God's attributes so that I don't pit one part of God against another. That's what's being fenced in. Okay, the next one, the universality of this dominion. What does he mean by this? Well, he just means that he's sovereign over all creatures, that his dominion extends as far as the heavens do over the earth. That's what that opening verse was meant to do, Psalm 103, 19. He adds to that, he says, well, let's look at the angels and demons for a minute. Even them, they're under God's total control. So Psalm 103:21 about the angels, that they are all his hosts, his ministers, who do his will. And it says in Isaiah 45:12 that where he stretched out the heavens and commanded all their hosts. The hosts there, Charnock says, is talking about the angelic host, not simply about the stars in the heaven and so forth. It's talking about the angels basically snap at God's command, doing all of his will. Now about the evil spirits, we're told not only that Christ created them in Colossians 1:16, and remember, he creates only good things. So the fall of the demons, I would just tell people, see Revelation 12, of the dragon who sweeps his tail and a third of the stars from the heaven fall and so forth. I've had people challenge me on that before. Where does it say that the demons were not created that way? I said, well, let's start with this. If they were created evil, then you've got two choices. Either God created them evil and God created an evil thing, or they created themselves or had some second evil creator, in which case you have dualism. So choose your poison there. And they're like, well, I don't want to. Well, no, that's what you're committed to. Okay? But as it is, there are verses that indicate that he created all things. Colossians 1:16 would be another. But look in narrative passages where you see even demons, again, begrudgingly, with evil intentions, doing God's bidding. Think of Job 1 and 2. And there are two verses in both of those. When the narrative starts in Job 1 and Job 2, when Satan is brought up into the court of heaven, what's the first words? Well, first God asks him, where have you been? Roaming the earth and so on. But who starts it? That's the way I say it. God does. God says, have you considered my servant Job? And he does it twice. The whole thing is God's idea. It's not, now Satan has evil ideas within that. But again, as Luther said, the devil is God's devil. 1 Kings 22:21 through 23 is another. Remember, God ordains these lying spirits to go. He says, who will lie for us? God does not lie. And so he uses these lying spirits to deceive in the world. And this affects the world of men. As against Egypt in Psalm 78:49, he let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, a company of destroying angels. So you have angels being used as, again, instruments of vengeance. We saw that a little bit when we looked at Genesis 19 about Sodom. And over the world of men, it says of Christ in Revelation 1:5 that he is the ruler of kings on the earth. And one more verse on that count, Proverbs 8:15, by me kings reign and rulers decree what is just. So when he says universal, he means literally universal. Everything that ever happens is God decreeing from his throne, from his courts. It is the outworking of his kingdom. Even the opposing kingdom, doing everything that it does, is following a script. Again, begrudgingly, against their will. They think they're going to do this, that, and the other. They hate God. But they are ultimately on his staging ground, being moved by his decrees. And then fifth, this speaks of the eternality of this dominion. And he makes a distinction, because remember, that's an attribute of God first. So he says, in regard of the exercise of it, the exercise of his dominion, that was not from eternity, because there was not from eternity any creature under the government of it. But in regard of the foundation of it, his essence, his excellency, it is eternal, as God was from eternity almighty. But there was no exercise or manifestation of it till he began to create. Okay, so there's lots of values of that. There's all kinds of pages. I think I'm bringing to you the most important stuff. The fourth section, I think, is probably the biggest, again, the manifestations of this dominion. Now, let me explain my pictures here, because he divides it into 4 sections. And the 4 sections are that his dominion is manifest, let's say it like that, in the making of laws. He starts with that. Secondly, in his sovereignty over persons. So here he calls God the proprietor, and he's not just talking about his sovereignty and salvation, but it includes that. I forgot to finish my picture. I was going to put a line coming here and a circle around one and not the other. There's a newer version of Sproul's Chosen by God, and the picture on the front has like a hand coming down and picking one off and another sort of falling off. And that makes the point of what I was trying to get at there. But it's just as well, because Charnock is going to talk about more than just predestination here. He's going to talk about all his dealings with man. Here, the third one, in ordering the affairs of history. So war was the first thing that came to my mind. And then fourth, in being Redeemer. So we'll talk about some of these. First, he's sovereign over moral action. And that's what he means by everyone being under law. And so why put that first? Because in creating human beings, that doesn't just start at Sinai. There's a law that Adam is under the moment that he is created. So here's the way Charnock sets this up. He says, this is essential to God. So he's going to go back to God first. Because of who he is, therefore, he has this right of law. No creature's will can be the first rule to the creature, but only the will of God. Only he can prescribe man his duty and establish the rule of it. Hence, the law is called the royal law, James 2:8. Let me pause right there. I don't know what all the commentaries on James would say, but at least Charnock is saying that this is why the law is called the royal law. I'm not sure he's saying that's the only reason it's called the royal law, but he's calling attention to God's sovereignty over human beings, over your moral action, and so forth. Okay. Both are joined together in, and he uses Isaiah 33:22, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. His sovereignty does not appear so much in his promises as in his precepts. A man's power over another is not discovered by promising, for a promise does not suppose the promiser either superior or inferior to the person to whom the promise is made. Now, again, he's not saying that his power has no bearing on the issue of promise. He's saying that God promising to be good for us in and of itself does not manifest his authority and power over us as much as his commanding our moral action. That's what he means there. And he treats this dominion of law under all sorts of heads, its supremacy, its extent. He has a section on even the difference between positive law and natural law or moral law in Scripture shows this. Because positive law, if you don't know what that word means, that's God commanding where there's not a clear reason given, where there's not a rationale. It's simply God positing something. People will use as examples of this shellfish or other things in the dietary laws. And you can make arguments, well, these are unclean for this reason and so forth. Yes, it all passes away in Christ. But other people will say, no, that's actually an example of positive law because it's simply God exercising his authority over us and saying, simply because I'm God, you obey in this case. I'm not giving you any reasons. And some people even put like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in that as well. They say, this is an example of positive law. Well, I'm not sure about that. But at any rate, that shows God's authority over us. If he never gave us any reason for any command, he would still be exercising his authority and dominion over us in his right to command. So you can get a sense of why that would show his dominion. I won't go into the depths of that, but let's talk a lot about this because he breaks that out into, I think, 9 different areas of his being the proprietor. No, 8. 8 different areas, and most of them regard salvation in one way or another. But it extends to other things. This is what Reformed people are typically going to mean when they talk about God's sovereignty, is God's sovereignty in salvation. And that is definitely a species of it. But he talks about not only his choice of some persons from eternity, but also bestowing the means of grace where he pleases. Or some people have Bibles. Other people have no Bibles. So you see the kind of thing you say, well, why? You could ask that just as well as why is that person regenerated and another person is not? Why did those people groups, before the coming of Christ, why did they live outside of God's light of salvation? That's a sovereignty issue. And one of the things he kind of touches on a couple times, and I always find this interesting, and I bring this to the Arminian a lot, is what about Israel in the Old Testament? I mean, you seem to have no problem with God choosing a nation, but what's a nation? It's a group of people. It's a group of individuals. Their ultimate destiny. But he didn't choose the Amalekites. He didn't choose and that's why I think a consistent Arminian who thinks about that stuff has to either change his mind and become a Calvinist, or he has to start inching over toward pluralism and then eventually universalism. Because he's bothered by this. Now, in a sense, we should be bothered by people being unsaved. But when what's bothering you is the goodness and the justice of God's decree, you got to start expanding that circle and saying, well, maybe the Amalekites, maybe they had some light that, and you get into pluralism and then eventually universalism. Okay? God also gives a greater measure of knowledge to some than to others. He calls some people into more special service in a generation than others. He bestows wealth and honor on some that he doesn't on others, and sometimes that's not the result of their laziness. Sometimes it's just Job, whole book of the Bible, right? And so sometimes what we call fortunes or luck or things like that is God dispensing more blessing over here versus there. There's a whole parable about it. The parable of the owner and all those workers. And what was the complaint at the end when some of the workers were coming at the 11th hour and they were getting the same pay as all the other ones? And the complaint was, hey, I've been working for you all day and this guy shows up at the last hour and you're giving him the same amount of money. And what's the response of the owner? Am I not allowed to give what I see fit with what is mine? There's the what is mine dimension of that. And so now when it comes to salvation, Charnock cites the typical passages that you would expect. Ephesians 1, 4 and 5, he comes back to that 3 or 4 times. And Romans 9, 13 through 20. So these are classic passages in that here in Ephesians 1 you have the Trinity, what the Father does in election, what the Son does in redemption, what the Holy Spirit does in sealing us. But it's all sort of an eternity's eye view of redemption, of sovereign grace. And Romans 9, obviously, which I'll mention probably 2 or 3 times in the sermon today, on election, and God loving Jacob and hating Esau without respect to anything they had done. So he makes the point to say, before they were born or had done anything either good or evil. And then he puts a stamp on it by saying, not for this reason, but so that my purpose in election might stand, the older shall serve the younger. So Charnock rules out some grounds here. And this is the only extended quote. It's not too extended. They don't have a slide for scratching my head. I thought I would have. But very simply, he just says, it could not be any merit in the creature that might determine God to choose him. Did not all lie wallowing in their own filthy blood? And what could the steam and noisomeness of that deserve at the hands of a pure majesty, but to be cast into a sink furthest from his sight? Think of passages like, there's Hosea 2, but also Ezekiel 16, talking about the bride. She was a harlot when God brought her in. So you have that kind of language that's used. Of course, Isaiah 64:6, all our righteousness is as filthy rags, and the expression there in the Hebrew is much dirtier. And those are the kind of pieces of imagery that Charnock's drawing on there when he says it in that way. But so election can't be conditioned on merit. He says, nor could it be any foresight of works to be done in time by them, or of faith that might determine God to choose them. And why is Charnock going there? Because the other view of someone who's not ignorant of the Bible altogether, and they understand that the word predestination and election and God choosing is everywhere in the Bible. So what they have to do instead is to say, okay, but what that is God looking down the corridors of time and seeing how we will respond in faith and choosing us on the basis of foreseen faith. And so Charnock is cutting that off at the head and looking at verses like Psalm 14, 2 and 3. So I always tell people when they bring that up, if only there was a verse in the Bible that tells us flatly what God sees when he looks down on the children of men. Oh yeah, Psalm 14, 2 and 3. God looks down, and it doesn't say quarters of time, but it says when God looks down on the children of men to see if there are any who are, and this is the verse that Paul draws from in Romans 3. When he looks down to see if there are any who choose him, any who will seek after him, any who love him, and he says, there is none. There is no one who does good. There is not even one. Together they have become corrupt and so forth. And so he brings in that verse to say, no, as far as God looking down the corridors of time, because all he would see is sin. So he uses another verse, 2 Timothy 1:9. He saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began. And about those twins that I mentioned, that Paul is using as his case study, Jacob and Esau, Romans 9:11, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might continue. Here's the part I left out. Not because of works, but because of him who calls. He does give an extended quote to this, the unfairness objection. Here's how Charnock responds to that. He says, justice or injustice comes not into consideration in this case. There is no debt that justice or injustice always respects in its acting. If he had pleased, he might have chosen all. If he had pleased, he might have chosen none. It was in his supreme power to have resolved to have left all Adam's posterity under the rack of his justice. So you're familiar with that. That R.C. Sproul statement in Chosen by God pretty much says the same thing. And that's just, again, I just say about these things, that's monotheism 101. If you believe in God at all, and if you have a Christian understanding of sin, then your operative first principle should be, how can you be saved? The disciples' response. If this is true, how can anybody be saved? And that's where he says, with man this is impossible, but with God All things are possible. So he uses other examples, the means of grace and so on. For example, Charnock says, he asked the question, why these effects over here versus over there? Why are these people drawing a crowd? Why are these people having, these kind of spiritual manifestations? Charnock replies, the foundation of this is not in the gospel itself, which is always the same, nor in the ordinances, which are channels as sounds at one time as at another, but divine sovereignty, which spirits them, brings them alive, as he pleases and blows when and where it lists. And he's drawing from John 3:8 there. Okay, so again, his government of history and redemption, we've kind of talked about that in previous classes. But we can use the example of Israel too. And here's how he does that. And he's talking about just what's going on in biblical history. He says, what was the reason Israel was rent from Judah and both split into two distinct kingdoms? Because Rehoboam would not hearken to sober and sound counsels, but follow the advice of upstarts. You can imagine that's somebody's response to Charnock. But then he's basically saying, okay, well, what was the reason he did not hearken to sound advice? Since he had so advantageous an education under his father Solomon, the wisest prince of the world. Now he gives you the real answer. 1 Kings 12:15, the cause was from the Lord, that he might perform what he had before spoken. So there's lots of verses like that that'll give you some human cause, but then at the end of it said, because this was from the Lord. There's other verses that talk about this, about human beings in general. Jeremiah 10:31, the way of man is not in himself, it is not in him who walks to direct his step. Proverbs 16:9, the same, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. And then finally, he has, as always, the uses section. And I just give a couple of verses that he uses under each of those sections, but the practical use of contemplating God's dominion. For instruction, just for example, he says, how great is the contempt of this sovereignty of God? Man naturally would be free from God's empire to be a slave under the dominion of his own lust. The sovereignty of God as a lawgiver is most abhorred by man. There's even verses that talk about his own people. You abhor his statutes, Leviticus 26:43. And to mankind as a whole, in Proverbs 1:25, you have set at nothing all my counsel and would have none of my reproof. So his point there is that contemplating this is our instruction and our wisdom, so that we don't become like people that don't want to have anything to do with his sovereignty. Admonition, he talks about those that are reprobate, that this is a terrifying doctrine to them. And you see that with a lot of these attributes, that this is a comfort to the elect, but a terror to the unbeliever. So I will stop there. Those are just verses for you to study out if you like, and open it up to questions or comments.